Hey everybody, if you've been around my channel for any length of time, you've probably heard me say on more than one occasion that the data don't indicate there was ever a deity in ancient Southwest Asia named Molech or Moloch, and that word in the Hebrew Bible is actually just a noun that refers to a specific type of offering that usually involved a newborn child, but could involve a substitution with an animal or sometimes money. Now, the reason that this reading became popular, that this was the name of a deity, is because that helped obscure the original recipient of these offerings, which in many cases was likely Adonai, the God of Israel. And there are a couple of pieces of literary data that point in that direction. For instance, Exodus 22, 28, and 29, that's if you're looking in the Hebrew, it's verses 29 and 30 if you're looking in an English translation. This is one of the earliest layers of the covenant code. We have this requirement that Israelites give their firstborn to God, and then it says you must do the same thing with the firstborn of your cattle and your sheep. This is clearly a reference to sacrifice. Now, there are later literary layers like Exodus 13 and elsewhere where this gets renegotiated, where redemption is required, or where it's understood as a reference to commitment to the priesthood or something like that. But it was likely originally understood exactly as it reads, as a requirement for human sacrifice. And we even have texts elsewhere that interpret it that way, like Ezekiel chapter 20, verses 25 and 26, where Ezekiel says, speaking on behalf of God, says, I gave them commandments that were not good, so as to desolate them. They're causing their firstborns to cross through the fire, which is an idiom for child sacrifice. And this was basically a way for God to show Israel who's boss. Now, predictably, there's a lot of pushback from folks who are not comfortable with that. Now, I'd like to share a response from another creator who actually shares some scholarship that I would also like to respond to.
In this video, I want to focus specifically on the passage in Ezekiel. Does Ezekiel acknowledge that God at one time commanded Israel to sacrifice their children to him? Frankly, Dan's interpretation of this text strikes me as contrived and a little conspiratorial.
All right, let's see it.
For a better interpretation of the textual data, see this paper from Kelvin Freebell. As Freebell argues, in Ezekiel 20, 25-26, the author is not referring to laws that God gave to Israel to obey. This is obvious by the fact that throughout the chapter, the text makes a sharp distinction between God's laws that he gave at Sinai for his people to obey and these quote-unquote not good decrees in verse 25.
So this is not the only response that offers an alternative reading to the child sacrifice reading. One that's actually cited more frequently is by Scott Hahn and John Bergsma from 2004, published in the Journal of Biblical Literature, that argues that the reference is actually to the Deuteronomistic literature as the laws that were not good because they resulted in Israelites not offering the firstlings, not offering the best of the best, and so they could not live by that legislation. Now, the paper that this creator has cited comes from this 2005 Festschrift for Michael V. Fox, and the author of the paper is actually one of the editors of the volume, and it should be noted that Festschrifts tend to have a slightly lower peer review standard than a publication like the Journal of Biblical Literature. So I think the reason the other one gets cited more is because I think it is a little more rigorous. So the article that this creator is sharing makes a very technical case that is going to conclude that we should be understanding verse 25 not to refer to commandments and legislation that God gave Israel requiring them to sacrifice their children, but we should understand it to refer to decrees that God gave to Israel, basically announcing that they were going to go into exile and that God was going to declare them unclean, and because they were going into exile they would not be able to live, meaning they would not prosper, they would not multiply. And this argument has a foundation built on the observation that the two words that are generally translated statutes and commandments in this verse, chukim and mishpatim, are to be distinguished from the references elsewhere in the chapter to statutes and commandments that God gave to Israel at Sinai. And this distinction is based on three observations. The first observation is that in this couplet, chukim and mishpatim, chukim is a masculine plural. Elsewhere in the chapter, when that word is used to refer to God's statutes, it is in the feminine plural. It's chukot. The second observation is that elsewhere where it refers to God's statutes and commandments, God says, my statutes and my commandments. So there is a possessive suffix attached to the word, and that's not the case in verse 25. And finally, elsewhere in the chapter, when it refers to God's statutes and commandments, there's a verse that says, you will live by them. Whereas in verse 25, it says these chukim and mishpatim, they could not live by them. So based on these three observations, the article is saying we have to look elsewhere to better understand what this reference to chukim and mishpatim is. And they go look at a number of other passages from elsewhere in Ezekiel and from elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible to arrive at this argument that, well, it must not be referring to statutes and commandments, but to decrees and declarations. Now, the biggest problem with this argument is we do not have to go outside of Ezekiel chapter 20 to find the parallel to our masculine, plural reference to legislation by which Israelites could not live. We just have to go to verse 18, because we have in verse 18 chukim in the masculine plural and mishpatim also in the masculine plural. And this is a reference to the laws of the Israelites' fathers and ancestors, and it says that they defiled themselves by those laws. And so these were laws that came before the law that was given at Sinai. And so we have this same idea of chukim and mishpatim that were means of defiling Israel in verse 25. The parallels are very clear. And so the rhetorical force of 25 and 26 is not, I am going to decree that you're going into exile and I'm declaring you unclean. The idea is you used to live by your ancestors' statutes and commandments, not from me, but from the world around them, and that caused them to worship other gods, and that caused them to sacrifice their children, and that caused them to defile themselves. Then I gave you my statutes and commandments by which you were going to be able to live, and you have been disobeying me. And so what I'm going to do is give you those statutes and commandments from before by which you can live, and I am going to defile you. So basically, that law that I gave you, I'm going to slap another layer onto it, and it's going to be legislation that your ancestors followed, basically requiring you to go sacrifice your children. And that is how I am going to defile you. That's how you're not going to be able to live, and that's how I'm going to show you who's boss. So the article this creator cites overlooks the clearest and the closest parallel to what's going on in verse 25 in favor of going outside of the chapter and this very tricky, complex argument for why we shouldn't understand these words as they're found within the very chapter we're looking at. We should understand them in terms of minority usage that has nothing to do with the way this author uses the word. And that's because it's motivated by a dogma to avoid the plain meaning of the text. That Ezekiel is having God say, I commanded Israel to sacrifice their own children, which is the plain reading of Exodus 22, verse 28 in the Hebrew, verse 29 in the English. So this is an apologetic attempt to sidestep the data, what the plain meaning of the text is, and I don't think it works.